There is only one miracle of all the miracles which Jesus worked that is found in all the 4 Gospels. And it is the miracle that we will hear about today, the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, in which 12 baskets are gathered. In all the 4 Gospels, the numbers are the same, 5,000 and more people, 5 loaves, 2 fish, and 12 baskets. The possible reason why this miracle is narrated by all the 4 Gospels is because it was a very, very important miracle in the life of Jesus and in the life of the early church. It communicates the generosity of the Lord. It communicates the magnanimity of Jesus, and it communicates also that there will be left over even after the multitudes are filled. The miracle begins by telling us that Jesus is addressing a large crowd of people. He is teaching them about God's love. This teaching is in words. It is a verbal proclamation. However, as far as Jesus was concerned, the teaching was never restricted to words only. It also translated into action. And so Jesus tries to test his disciples to see whether they have understood what he wants to communicate, and says to Philip as a representative of the other disciples, how are we going to feed these people and where are we going to get the bread from? Philip, of course, has not assimilated fully what the Lord wants to teach, and so already puts a block, he puts a limitation and says that even if they had 200 denarii, which was 6 months' wages for one laborer at that time, even if they had that much of money, and even if there were bakeries open which would supply that amount of bread, what they would get would be enough only for a small morsel for each person. So Philip has put a number of limitations. He says, first of all, they do not have 200 denarii. Second, there will be no bakeries around this deserted place that will be open and able to supply bread. Third, even if that happened, the people would not really be filled, but would have just a small piece of bread. So notice, Philip keeps on putting limitations, keeps on putting blocks, keeps on putting hindrances to what the Lord can do. With the Lord, however, there is no block, there is no hindrance, there is no limitation. And so they bring to the Lord the meager resources that they have. And what they have are 5 loaves and 2 fish. What does Jesus do? Before he can distribute the bread, Jesus looks up to heaven, where he knows God is, and he gives thanks. Very unlikely that a person will give thanks before the person receives the gift. In the usual way in which we communicate with people, we say thank you to a person after the person has done us a favor. In the case of Jesus, however, this thanksgiving is given to God before God can multiply the loaves. And why is Jesus able to give thanks? Because he knows full well that what he believes will take place. And that is why, as far as Jesus is concerned, the thanks is given before the partaking of the meal, before the bread will be sufficient for 5,000 and more. And the second thing that Jesus does after giving thanks, he breaks the bread and gives it to the people himself. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus gives the bread to the disciples who give the bread to the crowds. But in the Gospel of John, because Jesus identifies the bread with himself, because Jesus identifies the bread with his whole being, this is what he wants to communicate. This is what he wants to give the crowd. So he gives the crowd the bread himself. The Gospel of John differs in the narration in many ways, but largely in these two ways, in which, unlike in the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus says the blessing over the bread, in the Gospel of John, he gives thanks. The Greek word for giving thanks is Eucharist. Eucharistein is the verb. And so, Jesus celebrates the Eucharist with this large crowd of people here in the deserted place. The second difference is that while in the Synoptic Gospels, the disciples will be the intermediaries, the disciples will give the bread to the people after receiving it from Jesus. In the Gospel of John, Jesus communicates, Jesus gives the bread to the people directly, as if to say, he's giving them his very self. The bread which is given to the people and the fish which they share is enough for the 5,000 and more, because after everyone has had their fill, they're able to pick up 12 baskets full of leftover so that nothing may be wasted. Food is not to be wasted. Food is not to be lost. It is precious and so must be gathered after everyone has eaten and had their fill. We go back to the limitations which Philip had expressed. And the first limitation was that they did not have 200 denarii. They did not have money enough to buy bread. That limitation is overcome. The second limitation was that there would be no bakeries open which would supply that bread. That limitation is overcome with the meager resources of 5 barley loaves and 2 fish which they brought to Jesus. And the third limitation, namely, that each one would get only a small piece of bread even if they bought 200 denarii worth, is again overcome, because each one has not only their fill and more, but there is also remaining to be gathered after everyone has eaten. In the first reading of today, there is a similar miracle which seems like a precursor to this great miracle, because in the first reading from the book of Kings, Elisha is also shown as a multiplier of bread. But Elisha is shown as a multiplier of bread when he is able to feed a meager 100 people and having 20 loaves. It is true that even in the case of Elisha, the people are fed, the 100 have their fill, and there is left over which they gather. The point which John and the other evangelists are making is this, that while this miracle does have a background in the Old Testament and in the multiplication of loaves by Elisha, it is very clear that Jesus is greater than Elisha. Elisha was able to feed only 100 people, and even after he had 20 loaves, Jesus is able to feed 5,000 and more people with a mere 5 loaves and 2 fish. In our lives, we often put limits on what God can do. We expect only a small amount from God, and often what we expect is what we receive. Because we are miserly, we think that God is also miserly. Because we are small-minded, we think that God is also small-minded. Because we think only in this narrow-minded way, we think that God also thinks in this narrow-minded way. But the truth is, as shown in the gospel text of today, our God is magnanimous. Our God is gracious. Our God is generous. Our God wants to give and keep giving till every one of us has had our fill. None of the evangelists tell us how exactly the bread and fish was multiplied, but all tell us about the 5 loaves and 2 fish that first were brought to Jesus. What you and I need to do is we do not need to consider that we have meager resources, which we indeed do. What we need to do is we need to take those resources, no matter how meager they might be, to the Lord, place it in front of the Lord, give it generously to the Lord, and the Lord, in the Lord's generosity, will multiply and make it enough, not only for ourselves, but for many others around us. Will you take the 5 loaves and 2 fish to the Lord so that He can multiply it in His generosity, in His